As I said earlier, the most important decisions about learning are not taken by teachers, they're taken by students. So activating students both as owners of their own learning and as learning resources for another is absolutely central if we are to maximise the power of formative assessment. So slide 31 details a study that was undertaken in America. 3 teachers were each teaching 4 Year 8 science classes, and this is a very well controlled experiment because they did exactly the same thing for 2.5 hours each week with all 4 classes they were teaching. But for half an hour each week, they did something different with 2 of the classes from what they did with the other 2 classes. So they were doing a 14-week project. They did 7 2-week investigative projects on forces in motion. And each project was scored on a scale of 2 to 10. It was 1 to 5 for a verbal presentation that each student did on what they discovered, and then a 1 to 5 on the reports that they submitted on these write-ups. So each student's submitting 7 pieces of work scored on a scale of 2 to 10. And they're all doing the same work apart from this half an hour each week. And for half an hour each week, 2 classes in each teacher's group, each teacher discussed their likes and dislikes about what they were doing with these investigative projects, and were asked to make suggestions to the teacher about how to improve their learning. And half the classes, for 30 minutes each week, were using scoring guides to do peer evaluation. They were asking each other how to improve their work. And so a student might say something like, well, you'll get a 2 for this because you've done this, and you've done this, and you've done this, but you won't get a 3 because you haven't done this. So the focus was on helping students engage in a scoring rubric through peer assessment, not to value the work necessarily, but just to help the student understand how to make it even better. And so the question I have then is, which do you think of these was the most effective? So here are some options. We've got 4 choices there. Who do you think would benefit most from this kind of approach of getting kids to discuss the scoring guide and how the work would be improved? Would it be high achievers? Would it be average students? Would it be low achievers? Or would all students benefit equally? Take a couple of minutes to discuss that with a neighbour. Okay, so as part of the design of the study, they'd given every single student in these classes the comprehensive test of basic skills, a test of basic reading and mathematics, to check that the control group and the treatment group were balanced in terms of overall achievement. And they found that they were. What they then did was to look at the scores on these 7 investigative projects of the kids separately by which third of the class they fell into in terms of the basic skills test. And what they found was that in the controls group, which are called the likes and dislikes group, there was quite a strong correlation between their basic skills test score and their achievement in the physics tasks. So the lowest achieving third of students achieved 4.6, the middle third achieved 5.9, and the top kids achieved 6.6. What's quite surprising is that the kids doing reflective assessment, helping each other improve their work by engaging in the scoring guides, outperformed the other kids across the board. And there's 2, I think, interesting features of the data on slide 35. The first is that everybody benefited by being in the reflective assessment group. This wasn't a case of improving the achievement of the lowest achievers by denying opportunities to the highest achievers. They actually improved everybody, but the size of the benefits were much greater for the lowest achievers. In other words, when we share the learning intentions with students, we tend to close the achievement gap, because a lot of kids come to school not knowing the rules of the game. And so middle class kids often do know the rules of the game, which is why they're successful. And often working class kids don't. And that's why sharing the learning intentions with students is so important. It's making sure kids get in school what they're not getting at home. Another project looked at the benefits of different kinds of peer interaction. So these were 15-year-olds studying world history, and half the students were trained to ask themselves questions and to interrogate what they were hearing as they were learning, and half the students were just told to do your best. And at the end of the lecture, the students were given time to review their understanding of the content that had been delivered. And half of the students were asked to do this individually, and half the students did this in groups. So what we have is 4 groups. One, students working individually on unstructured, in an unstructured way, students in groups just left to their own devices, and then two structured interventions, either students doing structured self-questioning on their own or doing structured self-questioning in a group. So what happened? Well, the really surprising thing is that the size of the benefits was so much greater for the students doing structured self-assessment, whether in a group or individually. This graph, slide 37, shows the outcomes, and it shows that actually the group work, where it was unstructured, was slightly effective in the short term, but 10 days later, when they were given a delayed post-test, the benefits had completely disappeared, whereas the students who'd done the structured approach to self-assessment had actually learned a lot. And that gain was maintained 10 days later. So it's structured group work that really makes a difference. It's much more important than the group work versus the individual. So some practical techniques for doing this, obviously to begin with, explaining the learning intentions at the start of the lesson. So making sure the kids understand where the lesson's going through learning intentions and, of course, more precise success criteria. And as I said earlier, the success criteria should really focus on how far away from the context of the learning can the students apply their knowledge. Consider providing the lesson objectives or the learning intentions in student-friendly language. And the reason I say consider is this. Of course, as with young students, we need to present stuff to them in language they can understand. But as students get older, I think it's very important for them to begin to understand the language of the subject. So if we're teaching writing skills, one of the things that's really important is a sense of audience in your writing. And ultimately, I think we do want students in high school to understand what a sense of audience is. And there's no easier way to say it than that. So as students get older, I think we have to start using with them the language of describing the subject that we use ourselves. So we are bringing them into the community of practice of which we, as practitioners, are already members. Use posters of keywords to talk about success. Students often don't understand that there are very subtle differences between words. So explain and describe do not mean the same thing in science. If I ask them to describe the graph of the reactivity of enzymes with temperature, then it's fine for them to say, well, it starts off low and goes up high and then comes down again. But that's not adequate as an explanation of the graph. So explaining is different from describing. Use planning and writing frames by all means, but it's important to consider that planning and writing frames need to be used carefully. Of course, they can structure students' work, and it helps students achieve better than they would do without the planning and writing frame when they're beginning. But as students get more and more expert, it's important to recognize that planning frames or writing frames can actually become constraints. If you remember the film Forrest Gump, the young boy is wearing leg braces or calipers when he's very young. And the point is that those things are both constraints and supports. When his legs are weak, then those leg braces help him do things he couldn't do beforehand. But as his legs get stronger, those leg braces get in the way. And planning frames and writing frames are just the same way. Of course, to begin with, they're a help, but as students get stronger, they actually become constraints. The clearer you are about the planning frame, the less likely you are to get truly amazing creative work from students that actually exceed your expectations. You know, as students get older, we want them to be throwing away those leg braces and doing work that breaks all the rules and is nevertheless amazing. Using previous year's work as annotated examples to flesh out scoring guides or assessment rubrics. So before you get kids to do a lab report in science, give them some samples of previous work, suitably anonymized, of course, and get them to talk about the qualities of each piece. Are some of them better than others? If so, why? What's better about the good ones? Children are much better at spotting mistakes in other people's work than they are in their own. And when they actually understand the scoring guide or the assessment rubric in the context of somebody else's work, they are far more likely to be able to use that in their own work. So starting with somebody else's work is much better than starting with your own. And then finally, giving students chances to design their own tests. It's been shown that getting students to write test questions with correct answers on what they've been learning improves their test scores by more than the equivalent time spent doing practice tests. It seems to engage the students in more thoughtful activity and more strategic thinking. So rather than just getting them to do practice tests, get them to write test questions with correct answers for what they've been learning. When students are owning their own learning, obviously they can start doing self-assessment and peer assessment with rubrics or exemplars. And self-assessment of understanding with things like traffic lights or red and green. Let me say a bit about each of those. So traffic lights has become well known all over the world now as a kind of protocol for getting kids started with peer assessment or self-assessment. So the idea is you start off with an objective of the lesson, and at the end of the lesson the student does a self-assessment. Green means I've got it, yellow means not so sure, red means no idea what's going on. What we see, of course, is boys giving themselves greens where a girl would give herself a yellow. What do you expect? It's a self-report. Self-reports are unreliable, and those boys are choosing green not because it's an accurate self-assessment, but because they think it's cool. One teacher addressed this by saying, okay, red's over here with me, greens help the yellows, yellows make sure the greens understand this quite as well as they think they do. In this teacher's classroom, green means I'm now ready to teach this to somebody else. And all of a sudden, the boys were a lot more careful. Now, another teacher decided to use this basic technique, but in a much more real-time way. So she actually gives kids discs, red and green, red on one side, green on the other. And the idea is that you start with the green side showing, and if the lesson's going a bit fast, you flip the disc over to show red. And what this teacher has discovered is that there have been students who've never raised their hand to ask a question all year, but they were willing to turn the disc over to red to show they weren't understanding. The difficulty with these discs is they often can be quite hard to see and in a classroom, and therefore one teacher decided to modify this slightly by using coloured cups. So every student has 3 cups, green, yellow and red. And at the beginning of the lesson, the green cup is showing. And if the student thinks the lesson's going a bit fast, the student shows the yellow cup. And if they want to stop and ask a question, they put the red cup on the outside. Why would anyone show red? Because in this classroom, the rule is as soon as one student shows a red cup, the teacher picks another student at random, and whoever is chosen has to come to the front of the classroom to answer the question being posed by the kid who showed red. This teacher describes what she's doing as converting her classroom into one gigantic game of chicken. And her current problem is the students are stopping the lesson all the time. They're saying, I don't get it. Isn't that a great problem to have? And then finally, helping students be learning resources for one another. So on slide 40, there's some techniques there. So students assessing their peers' work. Before students turn in work, maybe get a buddy to sign off on them. So for example, of course, there are some higher order things that students can't do very well, but there are also many things that can be used as a checklist for all the things that need to be in place. If it's a science lab report, is there a method, is there a title, are there margins, are the diagrams labelled in pencil, all those kinds of things, and the buddy can check up on these. And then, as soon as the buddy signs off, the student can submit the work. But here's the important point. If there's anything the buddy has missed in the pre-flight checklist, then it's the student who signed off on this, not the student who did the work, who gets into trouble. Another useful protocol we found for getting kids started with peer assessment is what we call 2 stars and a wish. The idea is that when students are commenting on each other's work, first, they never write on each other's exercise books or notebooks. They're always writing on post-it notes. And the protocol they have to follow is this: 2 stars and a wish. I like that, I like that, I wish you had done that. The idea of being twice as positive as you are negative and framing the negative as a wish seems to be a very gentle, useful way of starting kids on peer assessment and then self-assessment. And then training students to pose questions. Many teachers wrap up a topic by asking the kids, right, anybody got any questions? And of course nobody puts their hand up because you don't want to look stupid. So instead, you can actually say, right, in your groups, decide if you've got any questions. And of course then, if nobody in your group can answer your question, it's not a stupid question, so you feel okay about answering it. And many teachers have found it very valuable to push this even further by saying, we've been over some complicated material here, you must have at least one question. What is it? In other words, you demand a question from each group. There is research showing that making kids make up their own questions about what they've been learning, not just test questions, but any questions to probe their understanding further, is more effective than just getting them to answer other people's questions. And then finally, the end of lesson student review. One teacher calls this Captain's Log. He's a bit of a Star Trek fan, and what he does is he has a rota, and all the kids take it in turns to lead the end of classroom plenary. So, every lesson, a student is on a rota, and they get up and they lead a discussion of what we learned in today's lesson. And I was very skeptical to begin with, but I've been amazed to see how willing and able children, even as young as 5 or 6, are able to talk intelligently about what they've been learning and how the whole class is working together. So it's about putting children in charge of their own learning, about maximizing the potential for children to be learning resources for one another. This is really the heart of effective formative assessment. Thank you.